Zendrian, founder of AtoZ Communications, and this is the Brand Stories podcast. This is where we talk about everything related to marketing, public relations, and just branding in general. This week, you guys are in for a real treat. We have the brilliant Matt Anderson of LifeWorks on. You'll see his different perspective related to the psychology of clients and his experience from direct mail come to bear in marketing strategy success. I have experienced some of your brilliance having a client who's worked with you and then afterwards was like, we need to have some of this brilliance out in the universe. So thank you for sharing it with me and my audience.
Well, you're too kind, Alexandra. I'm glad to be here today.
Oh, thank you. So my first question is, what's your favorite brand and why?
I always struggle with favorites and worst. I like a lot of brands, and then there are some brands that I don't really respect. But I would say that kind of a common answer that I'm sure you've heard from many people would be Apple. I think watching how that brand has evolved but stayed true to its kind of core ethos over now 50 years is really inspiring in some ways. And obviously it's a global brand, one of the strongest brands in the world. But if I were to pick one that's maybe not as well understood and that's more recently developing and evolving. So one thing I've done in my background is I've been a photographer. So I've done some commercial photography in a pinch, but then with a friend, I shot weddings for 15 years. And a gear company in that space that I think does a fantastic job in developing its brand is Peak Design. So they started out manufacturing camera plates and then added a clip that you could like attach to a backpack. Now they make backpacks and luggage and cell phone accessories and tripods, and they just keep expanding their footprint. But everything they do is extraordinarily high quality. And they grew their business primarily on the back of Kickstarters. So I think they have like 2 of the top 10 Kickstarters. But that is a great company to look at for how you can use guerrilla marketing techniques and just really clever like YouTube and Kickstarter video storytelling to build a narrative around a company and build a legion of raving fans. I think it's easy to look at Apple and say, I can never do something like that. But if you look at Peak Design, you might say, well, I might not have their production quality or creativity. I probably, especially if you look at some of their earlier stuff, have a budget to replicate some of that.
Yeah. So I appreciate the more approachable example because you're right. I feel like some of particularly financial advisors, if it feels like, well, there's no way that I'm ever going to achieve Nike or whatnot. Well, it's more achievable than you think it is.
It is. It is. I think people get intimidated by brand building because you hear the word brand and the first thing you think is Super Bowl ad. How many millions of dollars per second do I need to spend in order to get my message out there? But really, at the end of the day, it's about building an emotional connection with your audience and occupying a space in their mind. And you can do that on a small scale if you're in a town of 50,000 people and you've got 1,000 people in your network that know who you are and what you represent. If they're the right 1,000 people, you can build an incredibly lucrative career as a financial advisor on just that. But it's the same sort of thinking about the stories you tell and the nature of the connection you're trying to build that will determine whether you can build that relationship or not. And that's really what that brand is about.
Yeah. So I love that having experienced a teeny tiny fraction, I'm sure, of your work, that you've brought this to bear. How did you get into marketing and what's your career evolution been like?
I sometimes refer to myself as an accidental marketer. I never intended to get into marketing. It was the first thing from my mind when I was in college. So I went to college on a debate scholarship. That was what I did in high school and in college and was intending to go to law school. In fact, as an undergraduate, I took a number of classes at a prestigious law school and did well in those. And so that was the path I was on. I got a bit of a detour my senior year when I was nominated for and found out I was a finalist for a pretty prestigious scholarship. So I took a year off to find out how that would pay off. It's one of those things where they give you hundreds of thousands of dollars, send you to England and give you a prestigious title and all of that stuff. And I ended up washing out in the last stages to a guy who had one of the best records at the Naval Academy and spent his summer vacation killing terrorists. And another guy who patented a cure for cancer as a sophomore at Harvard. I was like, okay, fair. But anyway, after that, I had some time on my hands. And so I ended up in DC on a contract working at the National Archives. got connected with some lawyers out there, was offered a job I shouldn't have been offered in the federal government as a 22-year-old. But if I wanted to be a lawyer, it was the kind of job you needed to accept. So I accepted, moved home, planning to move to DC full time. And that was the week that Congress got out of the habit of passing the budget for the next 2 years. So this job I was hired for, they didn't have the money for this like measly $40,000 salary. And so I had another year on my hands and fell into consulting. And that started the process of deciding the world didn't need another lawyer. Now, at this consulting gig I had picked up, they had a bunch of patents they weren't using. And they were going through a workout process with their bank at the time because they had a non-performing loan. And so my job became taking these patents, figuring out how to turn them into products, wrapping marketing around them, and then getting them launched. And fortunately, one of those hit, paid off the loan, made the company whole, got the company acquired. And that kind of gave me the marketing bug. So after that job, I ended up apprenticing to one of the country's top direct mail writers. And it turned out my debate training gave me a knack to do that. And so the very first letter I wrote ended up becoming a control sample for a large organization. And it was their top performing package for 3 years. So for the next couple of years, I wrote a lot of direct mail. And I was going through some health challenges at the time. And so it was something I could do from home and it made sense. And once I was kind of through the health challenges, then I was, 26 at the time. I had to rationalize a resume that made no sense to people. Like, how do you get any one of these jobs? And then what is your skill set really, right? You're too experienced for most jobs and not experienced enough for, and I ended up talking my way into meeting an ad agency, and they met me and created a role where I could do business consulting, prepare their clients to be ready for marketing, because they were having a lot of firms come to them that weren't ready for marketing, and we needed to fix their pricing and business model and things like that. And then I would manage the client afterwards through the advertising process. And so that's kind of where I started getting more traditional marketing experience.
First of all, I give you credit for going through all of that. It seems like those are just the knocks of life that happen that, I thought that I was going to be a doctor. Well, in fact, whatever path leads me to wherever. But how did you pivot that into financial advice marketing in particular? And how do you feel like that's different than some of the other work you were doing?
At that ad agency, I was there for like 5.5 years. I, started out doing the consulting and kind of account management. And then about 18 months in, we made the strategic decision to move to more of a strategy-based model. And so I became one of the strategists. And then the financial crisis of 2008 happened. And all of a sudden, the challenger brands and Fortune 500s that were the clients of this firm didn't want to do a $200,000 strategy engagement just to start work. Sure. So it became my job to figure out how to take the deliverables we needed on the strategy side and produce them at a lower cost and hopefully at a better outcome. And so we rapidly developed a facilitation-based approach. And we discovered that creating facilitated exercises provided better discovery, built more support across the organization because more people were involved on the front end, and it got us better answers faster at a lower cost. So what was costing us $200,000, we were able to deliver to a higher level of quality with more success and more successful campaigns on the back end for $30,000, $40,000, depending on the complexity of the project. And so when I left that agency, I started picking up clients just doing that work on kind of a consulting basis while I was working on another business. And I've been evolving that process ever since. But to answer your question, how financial advice, I did have a rather prominent private bank and then really sophisticated asset manager as clients at that ad agency I was telling you about. And then later on, I did some consulting projects with some mid-market regional banks, not a household name, but bigger than you might think. And so helped them with marketing and pricing and business model and product definition and things like that. And then worked with a couple other financial advisors on the side. But it really wasn't until I got to LifeWorks that and helped build their training course for financial advisors and build their marketing that I started to focus more on financial advisors.
Nice.
So over the course of my career, I've worked in, I think, 36 industries now for more than 300 clients. And what I found and what's been really helpful for me is that these strategy tools I've developed work great, whether you're like B2B manufacturing, selling equipment to other manufacturers, or you're direct to consumer and shipping nutritional supplements, which I've marketed, or you're a financial advisor and you're trying to win clients. It's the same thought process in terms of customer discovery, brand character, pricing, how you define your message, and those things that I think are really the foundation of strategy.
Yeah. So of the strategy work that I've seen you do in person, what really kind of knocked my socks off was the archetypes that people have. And you were mentioning that it seems like a lot of, whether it's financial advisors or probably even just business people in general, don't really stick to those archetypes. They're just sort of all over the place.
Yeah, definitely. In the last couple of years, I've seen more marketing folks and agencies starting to talk about the archetype. The tool I actually picked up from some research done in the early 2000s at YNR, Young and Rubicon. And it's to this day one of the most impressive marketing studies I've seen. So, to give a little bit of backstory for your audience, at some point in the 1990s, the way the story goes, or the way it was told to me, a creative director at YNR was going through a divorce and started seeing a Jungian psychologist. And it's somewhat lost to the mist of time whether the analyst was actually able to straighten him out. But what we do know is that he became enamored with Jungian psychological analysis. And so he came back to YNR and he talked them into doing a study on how Jungian archetypes and personality types, which Jungian psychology is kind of the start of personality tests and stuff like that, how that could be applied to brand building. And so YNR, what's important to know about them is that they have the world's greatest longitudinal data set on attitudes and perceptions toward different brands. So since I think the late 60s, every quarter in 38 countries, they've run the same survey. And so they have longitudinal data on how customers perceive 18,000 brands that is consistent over time. So what they did in the early 2000s when this book was published is they took this data set, the attitudes and perceptions data, and they tried to map it to Jungian archetypes. Oh. And what they discovered was interesting. 80% of the brands did not have a recognizable archetype, which is to say that how customers perceive the brands in terms of the attributes that they gave them, the personality they were supposed to have, were not consistent with any one archetype. The waters were somewhat muddied. But what was interesting is the 20% of brands that did have a recognizable archetype. And so they created a combined financial metric that looked at how fast they grew, their market share, their pricing power, their profitability, their market appreciation of their stock. And they discovered that the archetypal brands, on average, over just about any time period, outperformed the archetypal brands on this combined financial metric by a factor of 12x.
Wow.
Right. Which is probably the most significant result I've ever seen in any marketing study, right? Like if you were to do some conversion rate optimization and get a 12x improvement on your landing page, I mean, you'd probably look for some marketing hall of fame to apply for membership in. I have a pretty good track record with those things. And I don't think I've ever achieved a 12x result on that. So now the problem with a study like that, I'm sure is probably occurring to your audience, and definitely it would occur to a financial advisor, is that correlation does not necessarily imply causation, right? It could be the fact that the reason these brands are archetypal in the attitudes and perception survey is just that they're more successful. And success breeds understanding in the audience. So what they did is they went back and they said, hey, can we find situations where the archetypal brands lost an archetype or where non-archetypal brands found one in the attitudes and perception survey? And that's what happened then. Mm-hmm. And they found in virtually every case that when a brand that didn't have an archetype found one, its growth took off like crazy. Nice. And when an archetypal brand lost one, it cratered within a quarter.
Wow.
And so that gave them a really strong belief that if you could align a brand with an archetype, it could only help. It's not going to hurt, and it could really provide some success. So can you guess the very first campaign that they gave an archetype to?
No.
As they were finishing this research, MasterCard came in and said, we need to revive our brand. we need to cause the next generation of customers to fall in love with MasterCard again.
Mm-hmm.
So the people who were working on this research were actually tasked with helming this campaign. They came up with an archetype for MasterCard, and the result was the Priceless campaign that ran for 20
Oh,
years. And I forget the exact numbers, but I think like within the first 18 months, they increased their market share like 20% or something, or there was
wow.
some double digit growth metric that they were trying to hit that they achieved with that campaign.
Yeah, that's
And to this
amazing.
day, many people refer to that as one of the best marketing campaigns in the 1990s.
Mhm.
For good reason.
Yeah, sure. So, how would a financial advisor, in their marketing, do you feel like this is one of those things that, like, look, you have to partner with somebody? There's no way that you could manage all of this all by yourself, or do you feel like read this book, do this thing, and you could probably give or take figure it out?
Yeah, so the archetype tool is one that I put last in the strategy process. And I do that for two reasons. One is that I think the other tools are much more important. This is something that when you do all the other work, you have your offer priced correctly, you've developed your selling messaging, you have built a strategy for what your brand character should be. You've developed your narratives, your brand narratives that build an emotional connection with the audience. You have a really rich and well developed psychological profile. If you do all that work, then the archetype can give you an extra nudge.
Okay.
But if you start with the archetype, you're going to miss the stuff that moves more of the needle,
Got
right?
it.
So the archetype, to my mind, is how do I have a framework that helps me make better creative decisions around like the colors in my logo, the typography I choose, the type of photos I put on the website, some of the words I choose in my copy. That's where it shows up most in the work I do, is kind of like those final grace notes on the marketing presentation. But it's really, if I were to tell anyone to start anywhere, it's have a well defined ideal client, develop a rich psychological profile of them,
Hmm.
and then build your selling message around that psychology. If you
Makes
can do
sense.
those things, that's the 80-20 of marketing success, whether you're a financial advisor or anything else. Now, to answer your question, is there a book or where would I send people? There wasn't a book that taught people to do things the way I've learned to over the past 20 years as I've worked on the strategy process. So
Mhm.
one of the things in my background that is why my process is so different is because I started with that direct response copywriting.
Yeah.
And then I moved to a brand focused ad agency. And so a lot of the tools I developed really emerged from that tension.
Mm.
So, as I said, I'm an accidental marketer. I
Yeah.
never intended to be a marketer. I've never taken a marketing class. I didn't go to business school. I'm coming into this and figuring this out on my own. And so I got a really good apprenticeship in direct response copywriting and all the direct sales psychology. And then
Mhm.
when I got to the brand agency, these really successful marketers who were from some of the largest agencies in the world, and to this day, if you were alive in the 1990s, if you saw their reels, you'd recognize every ad. They were that powerful and emotionally compelling. They said, oh, yeah, that direct response stuff, that doesn't work anymore. I'm like, well, I raised about $100 million in donations in a few years. Enough people still open the mail and still respond to a letter from an organization they've never heard of that works. So I knew that psychology worked. But
Yeah.
then I also could see the results of our clients at the agency, and I knew the brand stuff worked. And they
Mhm.
had completely different theories about what causes people to buy, how they interact with marketing, how you build a relationship with the client, what that relationship even should look like. As I was at the agency and I was like, okay, I'm probably going to do this marketing thing for the rest of my career. I read hundreds of marketing books and started trying to make sense of it. And then I started reading all the underlying psychological studies and the psychology books and all of that. And I started to realize that the key that unlocked the puzzle was in the fundamental consumer psychology and buying behaviors.
Mhm.
And so I took what I knew worked from consumer sales, direct response psychology, and the theories about how to build a brand that were prominent in the ad agencies at the time. And I started finding the common denominators. And then that provided the map to building the facilitation process. And so those tools are really about reconciling the differences. And I ended up becoming convinced that the way marketing strategy to this day is taught at like business schools or in most marketing books as a function of positioning is wrong.
Mm.
So, if you read like Reese, Al Reese's book on positioning, and you look at where that came from, right? It came out of two places, General Motors and Procter and Gamble. And they both discovered in the early 1920s that you could think about markets as territory on a map. And that in terms of what is relevant to them as big companies and consumer brands, there were only a handful of competitors they needed to worry about.
Right.
So in the consumer's mind, you could start thinking about the territory occupied by a brand as a function of their features and benefits lodged in the customer's mind.
Mm.
And that's really effective, right? In a world where distribution is scarce.
Yes.
And, distribution both for ads, because there's only so many radio stations or eventually TV stations and newspapers, and in terms of distribution of the product, right? There are only so many car dealers in a city, or there's only so many products on a shelf and only so many stores whose shelves matter if you're a national brand, right? So if you're, a toothpaste manufacturer, even today, your relevant competition is just who else is on the shelf at Walmart and Costco. Right. That's 80% of the market. Well, it's 3 or 4 brands and they have different varieties, but you know what your customer is choosing. And your job as a marketer is to come up with a message or packaging and slogans and TV ads that build brand associations that will cause them to pick up your brand on the shelf instead of the other guy's brand when they're standing in front of it in the aisle, right, in the toothpaste aisle.
Yep.
Well, that's not the reality for most of us, right? The internet fundamentally changed the game.
Yes.
You can build a consumer brand that's extremely lucrative that just sells very bespoke nutraceuticals or bespoke toothpaste that only 100,000 people in the country would care about, but it has such a unique selling story and proposition for them and what they care about that you can build a $100 million company just doing that. But marketing strategy hasn't caught up. What do you do in a world where there are billions of ad impressions served every day and your ad is showing up next to others just this minute on Facebook and they're just one click away from a competitor? And there are not 6 brands, but there are 200 brands, 2,000 brands in your category alone vying for your customer's dollar. Well, a bunch of things change fundamentally. One, the customer can't shop the entire market. Right. So mapping the entire market doesn't matter. 2, the customer's attention is the biggest constraint, not distribution channels. Sure. So your strategy becomes how can I create a message that will win with the customer I'm in front of, that I want to win, and is robust to whatever competitors they're aware of, whatever alternatives they're considered.
Yeah.
Right. And so for me, and especially coming from a direct response background, way back even in 2007, when I started doing this facilitation-based work, it became, the mantra was, your message is your strategy. You need to think about message not as a tagline, not as a positioning statement, not as, some general attitudes and perceptions, the kind of work that even the top strategy firms in the country are still doing, charging hundreds of thousands of dollars for. But you need to have a much more detailed, in-depth understanding of what your message needs to be at each step of the customer life cycle. Yeah. And you need to make sure that you understand how your selling messages can reinforce your brand and your brand can help your selling messages and how it's all underpinned by the customer psychology, and build a really robust set of assumptions there that are designed to be tested by the data that you can get from digital advertising. That will enable you to get to a point where you have a message that is working much faster. And because you have a robust set of hypotheses that in advance are going to fit together well, you can develop the whole thing much faster, much cheaper. And if a part of it breaks, you can go back and say, oh, hey, what assumption was wrong? And you can find it and fix it relatively quickly. So it requires a little more in-depth work up front, which even for your client who's a financial advisor, not a huge one, the final report was 150 pages long. Yes. But it contained everything. And then as a result, we were able to build all the assets in a couple of weeks.
Yes, I've never seen quite an exhaustive report. And you're right. We uncovered a lot of good work between 4 different sessions that we did. So I give you a lot of credit for your process. It very much works. So in terms of financial advisors and who they're competing with and customer psychology, how much do you feel like they're competing with the person who says, You know what? I'll just do my finances myself.
Yeah, well, I think it depends. I've run down positioning here for a few minutes, but my answer to that kind of depends on how the advisor is positioned,
Okay.
right? So if you're competing in the mass affluent space, like we are with LifeWorks, I'm now their CMO, but I still refer to them as a client, then you're going to run into that more often. But I would also say that, if they are a hardcore DIYer, I might say, is that really a client you want to win? Is the energy that you'd spend trying to win them something that is just going to cost you talking to two other prospects? And they're not going to be super happy with you anyway,
No,
right?
good point.
So the way we define our ideal client is someone who wants to live a more intentional life and values help in doing that. And if they don't value the help, then we teach our advisors to just say, talk to the next guy.
Yeah.
Now, they can do that though, because we're generating 3, 4, sometimes 500 leads for them a month.
Yeah.
And we're doing that with messaging that is unique to us, that it speaks to that ideal client, that speaks to the really kind of deep psychology that we've discovered about that client. So most of the clients who are coming in are really prepared for the kind of help we want, and they want it, and they're disappointed that their current financial advisor isn't giving them that. So when you get your marketing figured out, I think it can give you an abundance mindset that would allow you to be a little more disciplined in really taking the right pitches to swing at.
Love it. So speaking of LifeWorks, so it's been great. First of all, you guys have seen success in and among yourselves, which is amazing. And if you'd love to talk to that, I would appreciate it. But also
Sure.
you have your academy where so long as you're part of it, you're showing everything to everybody. How did you guys decide on that kind of level of transparency and wanting to share your knowledge?
Yeah, well, so I think Ron Bullis, the founder of the Future of Advice Academy, is someone who has always believed in the value of transparency. I think that he's someone who came out of a large firm and was disillusioned with their approach to production and maybe not serving the clients in the best way possible. And so I think when he started LifeWorks, he wanted to help change the way the industry treated advisors and treated clients. So he's always had kind of an education focus. We believe that if we can get more advisors operating the way we do, that it will prepare the ground for all of us to win clients. Because to this day, many people start at the broker dealer, or they start at the large national firm who's going to charge them too much, not provide enough value. And so if we can start to change customers' expectations around what financial advisors should do and do so in a way the big guys aren't willing to follow, then we're going to change the market in a way that benefits all of us. And so that's why we founded the Future of Advice Academy, which you can find at thefutureofadvice.com. And like you say, it's a program where we give away everything. We give away the strategy system that built LifeWorks. We show you what we're doing currently on our marketing and what's working. You can see the actual ads and landing pages. But we have a really good process in there that does some of what I talked about on this call, that you can go through this workbook and kind of build a starting point for your own marketing strategy. That's how your client found us. He's a member of the Academy, and then I worked with him one-on-one. And it has our sales process in there, how we set up our CRM, the sales language we use. There's like all the scripts we give to our advisors that are word for word that you can model. And then there's a client experience workbook in there of like how to deliver a world-class client experience. And then there's like all of our templates and tools and presentations. And we just uploaded the latest iteration of the proposal that we send out after every discovery meeting. And that's in there for you to model. But, the spreadsheets we use for financial planning and the presentations we use for deliverables and all of that's in there, as well as interviews with 20 of the largest RIA founders in the country that are privately available there. We just got off a call half an hour ago where we just, for 2 hours, took questions from members for what they're working on in their business. We do that every 2 weeks. And then we also do live events 3 or 4 times a year. So if you become a member of the Academy, you get a free ticket to those events, any of them that you want to come to. So one, if you can make it, the next one is in Austin, April 20th and 21st.
Nice.
And you can buy a ticket to that individually. That's I think the regular price is $19.95, but for $5,000 you can join the Academy, get a ticket to that and every other future event. And that's a 2-day event where we'll help you build your pricing strategy, your offer, and then help you build your marketing strategy in 2 days. You'll come home with a written plan that you got feedback from a couple of people who built 9-figure RIAs, and be well on your way.
I'm 1,000,000% sold on that. The fact that I feel like this is what events really ought to be, is that you come, you get your own work, everything's sorted out and individualized to yourself, and then you go back and you start implementing. So hats off to you guys for making that happen.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of fun, and it's really cool to see the culture that's developed around that. The RIA founders who come really want to help each other,
Nice.
and there's it's a really open and sharing atmosphere. But also, we give you time to work. We have AI bots for each exercise that are really good at accelerating the progress. And we don't really believe in the value of conferences where you get big name speakers who just vomit at you for an hour and turn, and you get a notebook full of things. And then you get home and it's like, well, I don't know if I could actually implement any of this. We want to focus on the things that will really make a difference to you and growing your firm. And we want you to come back with clarity, ready and willing to execute. And for our members who come multiple times, I was talking with someone just today who's been to every single live event, and he's coming to this one. It's like, I wouldn't miss it. And it's like, well, it's not new content for you now. And he's like, well, it doesn't matter. 2 days out of the office to work on my business is the most valuable thing I can do. And even though I've heard the presentation now a couple of times on strategy or marketing, I always come away with something.
Wow, that's an amazing selling point. So thank you so much for sharing all your brilliance with us. I feel like I could probably have you on again, because I feel like there's so much more that you probably do have to share. But I appreciate your generosity and that of LifeWorks. It's great that you're giving an example that people can really learn from.
Yeah, no problem. Just one last thing as we close. You did ask for a book recommendation, and so I hesitate to do this, but because I couldn't find a book that taught like message-based marketing strategy the way I wanted to, because I had people who kept coming to me who, for whatever reason, the size of their business or where they were at, they couldn't afford to have me help them. I ended up writing a book a couple of years ago.
Oh, nice.
And that the idea on that, it really walks you through step by step the basics from a business owner's perspective, not a professional marketer. But what do you as a business owner need to contribute to a professional marketer to help them be successful, help them do what they do well, while you make smart marketing decisions for the things that you ultimately have to control. Like, who is my ideal customer? What is their psychology? What is my offer? How do I price it? What needs to be in there? And then what is my selling message, right? The ingredients of that are in that book. And then there's also some discussion in there on character-based branding. And that's actually how I got reconnected to LifeWorks. I had known Ron in a previous life, and I sent him a copy of a book in case some of his clients might need it. And it's like, well, as it happens, this is what we need right now, and never dreamed you might be available. So, but anyway, you can get it on Amazon. It's not very expensive, but I've been told to help people. So if anything that we talked about here kind of raised your curiosity, that would be a good place to start.
I will be purchasing that as soon as we're done.
Very good. Yeah. Very good. Well, thank you for having me on. I'd be happy to come back.
Of course.
Really appreciate it. Next time, though, I'll try not to just talk at you all the time.
Oh, you have a lot of great things to say. I'm not going to stop brilliance. That's just silly.
Well, you're too kind. You're too kind. But thank you very much. This has been fun.
Thank you.